Staff Sergeant Tyler Brennan snatched the field manual right out of her hands, held it up in the air like a trophy, and ripped it clean down the spine. Pages scattered across the bar floor like confetti at a funeral. He leaned into her face close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath and laughed. "You reading war stories, supply girl, go back to counting boxes." And Sarah Kincaid said nothing. She just looked at him, and that look, calm, cold, and terrifyingly steady, was the only warning he would ever get. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The bar was called Rosie's Tap Room, and it sat 3 miles outside the main gate of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop that had been selling soldiers' guitars and wedding rings since 1987. It wasn't a fancy place. The neon Budweiser sign in the window buzzed and flickered like it had been doing for the past decade. The pool table in the back had a warped felt surface that made the 8-ball drift slightly left every single time. The jukebox still had Merle Haggard in the rotation. And on a Tuesday night in November, the place was packed with soldiers who had finished their duty day and were looking for 3 things: cold beer, loud company, and someone to talk down to. Sarah Kincaid had been sitting at the far end of the bar for 47 minutes. She had a glass of water in front of her, not beer, not whiskey, just water with 2 ice cubes and a small, worn field manual open on the bar top beside it. The manual was dog-eared at the corners and had handwritten margin notes in pencil, the kind of notes that came from someone who had actually used the information inside, not just read it once for a test. She wore her Army combat uniform, the standard issue kind, with the Supply Corps branch insignia on her collar and specialist rank on her chest. No Ranger tab, no combat patch on her right shoulder, no jump wings, nothing that would make anyone look twice. That was entirely the point. She was 29 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back tight, and brown eyes that moved with the slow, methodical sweep of someone doing a constant automatic scan of every room she entered. Not nervous, not paranoid, just aware. The way certain animals are aware. The way a hawk is aware, sitting perfectly still on a fence post, while every mouse in the field continues living its last few minutes in complete blissful ignorance. The Rangers at the center of the bar didn't notice any of that. What they noticed was a female specialist sitting alone reading what looked like a military manual, wearing a supply branch patch, and minding her own business. To Staff Sergeant Tyler Brennan and his crew of 7, that combination was basically an invitation. Brennan was the kind of soldier who wore his confidence like body armor, thick, heavy, and covering every inch of him. He had the Ranger tab, the combat patch, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from something hard and left out in the sun too long. He was 26, physically dominant, and possessed of the specific kind of arrogance that grows in men who have been genuinely exceptional at one thing their entire adult lives and have never been required to develop humility about anything else. He noticed Sarah the way a bully notices a quiet kid in the cafeteria. It starts small. That's the thing, people forget about how cruelty operates. It doesn't announce itself. It begins with a look, then a nudge to the guy beside you, then a louder than necessary comment aimed at no one in particular, designed to land somewhere specific. Brennan started with a comment to his buddy, Corporal Danny Walsh, loud enough to carry across the bar. "Supply Corps," he said, tilting his beer in Sarah's direction. "Must be reading the manual on how to order the right-size pencils." Walsh laughed. A couple of the others turned to look. Sarah did not look up from the page. That was actually the mistake. Not looking up was to Tyler Brennan an act of arrogance. He was used to people looking up. He was used to the room noticing him. A woman in a supply patch alone at a bar ignoring him that required correction. He walked over. He stood beside her bar stool and looked down at the manual. His eyes moved across the page, and for just a second, something shifted in his expression. Because what was on that page wasn't a supply regulation. It wasn't a logistics manual or a parts catalog. What was on that page was a classified section on precision ballistic calculation at elevation, the kind of material that existed in field manuals used by exactly one community in the United States Army, and it wasn't the Supply Corps. But the moment passed and Brennan filed it under, "She grabbed the wrong manual from somewhere." because the alternative that she was supposed to have it didn't fit the story he had already written about her. "What are you reading, specialist?" he asked, not curious, performative. She looked up then, and the look she gave him, it wasn't nervous, it wasn't defensive, and it wasn't the look of someone trying to diffuse a situation. It was the look of someone who had already processed the situation 3 moves ahead and was simply waiting for the current moment to catch up. "Field manual," she said. Her voice was even. Not flat, there was something behind it, some quality of control, like a river that looks calm on the surface because all the force is happening underneath. "Field manual," Brennan repeated, drawing it out, looking back at Walsh with a grin. "For supply, because you're what trying to figure out how to count ammo crates." "Something like that," she said, and looked back down at the page. That was the second mistake, looking back down, because it said clearly and without any ambiguity that she was done with this conversation. And Tyler Brennan had not given her permission to be done. He reached out and put his hand on the manual. Not aggressive, not yet, just laying his palm on the open page, blocking the text. A power move. Small, controlled, deliberate, and "I'm talking to you," he said. She looked at his hand on the page. Then she looked up at him. And she said with the same even calm, completely unreadable voice, "I know." There was a beat of silence. Across the bar, Walsh had gone quiet. One of the other rangers, a big quiet kid named Specialist Marcus Webb, had straightened slightly on his bar stool because something in the air had shifted just a degree in a direction that he couldn't quite identify, but that his combat-trained instincts recognized as something other than a normal bar interaction. Brennan felt it too. He didn't understand it, but he felt it, that slight wrongness, like a step you take that lands 2 inches lower than you expected. He covered it the way men like him always do, by pushing harder. He picked up the manual. He held it up like evidence. He turned it so Walsh and the others could see the cover. He read the title out loud, making it a performance, and then he paused because the cover didn't say what he expected. It was marked with a series of letters and numbers that didn't mean anything obvious to him, and below that, a classification marking that made Walsh's eyes narrow slightly behind Brennan's shoulder. But Brennan, committed now, kept going. He opened it, flipped it to a random page, held it up like he was showing everyone a joke, and read out a passage about wind drift and bullet drop at 800 meters that he deliberately mispronounced and mangled into something ridiculous. The boys behind him laughed on cue. He was performing and they were his audience, and that was the whole architecture of the moment. Then he closed it, held it over the bar, and let it drop. It hit the floor, open-spined pages splaying out across the concrete. "Stick to the requisition forms, specialist," he said. "Leave the field work to people who've actually been in the field." Sarah looked at the manual on the floor. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked up at Tyler Brennan, and the look on her face was the same look it had been the entire time, calm, steady, measuring, and she said nothing. She bent down, picked up the manual, closed it carefully, and set it back on the bar. Brennan was already walking back to his crew, already receiving the slaps on the shoulder, already accepting the performance's applause. He had written her off before he even finished turning around. She was filed, categorized, dismissed. Just a supply clerk who couldn't take a joke and didn't have the spine to push back. He had no idea, none. Not the faintest shadow of a clue that in the 47 minutes she had been sitting at that bar, she had already cataloged every one of his men. Walsh favoring his left side. Old rib injury, probably ribs 4 and 5, the way he unconsciously pivoted when he shifted weight. Combat deployment, 2nd or 3rd tour based on the specific pattern of tension around his eyes. Shooter right-handed, slower draw than he thought because the rib made him compensate. The big quiet one, Webb, genuinely dangerous. No unnecessary movement. Economy of motion. The kind of discipline that was trained deep and held under pressure. She'd actually noted him as the one in the group most worth paying attention to, and she'd done it within the first 4 minutes of them arriving. Brennan himself, dominant alpha positioning, high pain tolerance, evident in how he moved through an old knee injury he didn't know was visible. Quick processing speed, but emotional override. He made decisions with his ego before his brain finished the calculation. Strong, fast, brave, and completely convinced that the information his ego fed him was accurate. That was his actual weakness, not the knee, the certainty. She had run this kind of analysis on human beings the way other people ran weather apps. Automatically, constantly, without effort and without mercy. It was not something she had decided to do. It was something that had been trained into her over 3 years of an existence that very few people in the United States military knew about, and that had no formal name in any database that could be publicly accessed. Her file, the real one, not the cover, sat behind 6 layers of clearance in a system that most of the personnel in that bar didn't know existed. Her assignments didn't appear in standard deployment records. Her qualifications didn't show up in the standard evaluation pipeline. Her handlers communicated with her through channels that had about as much in common with normal military administration as a submarine has in common with a paddle boat. Officially Specialist Sarah Kincaid, 25th Support Battalion Supply Corps, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Unremarkable service record, quiet, keeps to herself, does her job. No disciplinary issues, no commendations worth noting, no combat experience, no special qualifications. Unofficially in the language of people who knew Phantom 5. That designation didn't appear on paper. It was spoken only in certain rooms by certain people in certain contexts. Ghost-level operator, a compartmentalized asset used for missions that required a precision effect that couldn't be traced back to any identifiable unit or conventional force structure. No spotter, no team, no command element in theater. The kind of asset that existed in a space between special operations and something that special operations itself didn't entirely have visibility into. She had been recruited at 23 out of a college ROTC program at a school in rural Virginia after she scored a performance on a long-range marksmanship evaluation that the evaluator initially refused to certify because he was convinced the equipment had malfunctioned. It hadn't malfunctioned. She had simply quietly and without any apparent emotion or exertion shot a qualification score that had never been recorded before in the program's history. The evaluator had flagged it as anomalous. Someone several pay grades higher had looked at the flag and made a phone call. And 6 weeks later, Sarah Kincaid had been sitting across from a man in civilian clothes in a room with no windows, who had explained to her in careful and measured language that the United States military had a particular kind of job that required a particular kind of person, and that she appeared to be that person, and that if she agreed, her life was about to become very different from anything she had imagined when she signed her commission paperwork. She had said yes. She had not said it quickly or excitedly or the way someone says yes because they're flattered. She had sat with it for 30 seconds. 30 seconds of complete silence, which the man across the table had apparently found slightly unnerving, and then she had said, "What are the operational parameters?" He had smiled, the first real smile in the conversation. "We'll get to that," he'd said. "First, do you have any questions about the commitment?" "One," she said. "If I decide later that this isn't what I want to do, what are my options?" He'd looked at her steadily. "Very limited." "Understood," she had said, and then she'd said yes. That had been 6 years ago. In those 6 years, she had been deployed 7 times. The specifics of each mission were classified at a level that made the word classified feel inadequate. What could be said in the broadest possible terms was that in each of those deployments, a problem had existed, a significant, complex, strategically critical problem involving hostile forces in positions that conventional military action could not address without unacceptable risk or unacceptable visibility, and that after Sarah Kincaid was inserted into the operational environment, that problem had stopped existing. She had never fired from the same position twice in a single mission. She had never been identified by enemy forces. She had never been photographed. And she had never in 6 years and 7 deployments lost a target she had designated. The Rangers at the center of Rosie's tap room were drinking their 3rd round and laughing about something one of them had said, completely unaware that the woman they had just publicly humiliated had a confirmed kill record that would make every one of them fall silent for a long, long time. She ordered another water, 2 ice cubes, opened the manual back to the page she'd been reading, continued. The door opened 40 minutes later, and the room changed. It's hard to explain exactly how the arrival of certain authority changes the atmosphere of a space, but anyone who has spent time in the military understands it on a visceral level. There is a quality of alertness that snaps into place, chairs scraping slightly, posture, adjusting conversations, lowering in volume before anyone has consciously processed who just walked in. It is the body reacting to rank before the brain catches up. Colonel Arthur Greystone did not need to announce himself. His presence did it for him. 54 years old, 32 years in uniform, 2 combat commands. The kind of man whose bearing alone communicated that he had been in rooms that most of the people in this bar would never enter and had made decisions that would never be declassified in his lifetime. He scanned the room once, found what he was looking for in exactly the amount of time it takes a man with 32 years of training to find what he's looking for. He walked directly to the far end of the bar. He stopped beside Sarah Kincaid. She closed the manual before he reached her, had it closed and on the bar in front of her by the time he arrived, which meant she had heard him or sensed him from the moment he entered the room. The colonel noted that without changing his expression. "Specialist Kincaid," he said, his voice low, not caring. "Sir," she said. She did not stand. They were in a civilian establishment, and standing would draw attention. She clearly preferred not to draw. "We need to go," he said. "Now." Something moved across her face. Barely there, the almost imperceptible shift of a person recalibrating their understanding of what the next several hours were going to look like. She looked at the manual on the bar, then at her glass of water. Then she stood. "Yes, sir," she said. The colonel turned and walked toward the door. Sarah picked up the manual, tucked it under her arm, left a $10 bill on the bar, and followed him. At the center of the room, Brennan watched her leave with a colonel he didn't recognize, and felt the first hairline fracture in his certainty just for a second, just a single beat where something didn't quite add up. And then Walsh said something behind him, and he laughed and turned back to his beer and let it go. The bar went back to its noise. The jukebox cycled to a new song. In the parking lot, the colonel's vehicle, a plain black government sedan, no base markings, was already running. A driver in civilian clothes. Another man in civilian clothes in the front passenger seat with a tablet in his hands, the kind that displays information too sensitive for most people in this branch of service to ever see. Sarah got into the back seat. Greystone got in beside her. The door closed. "What's the situation?" she said. Her voice was exactly the same as it had been in the bar, same tone, same steadiness, as if she had not just walked out of a social setting and into whatever was coming next, but as if the transition between those two things was simply another moment in a continuous stream of moments that all required the same quality of attention. "Helmand Province," Greystone said. "Firebase Kestrel. We have a Ranger Company 48 personnel that went into what was supposed to be a secure position 6 hours ago. Their route back is cut. Their perimeter is compromised. We have 200-plus fighters converging in a coordinated pattern that someone planned very carefully, and we didn't see until it was too late." He paused. "They have maybe 11 hours before the assault hits full strength." Sarah was quiet for a moment. The sedan pulled out of the parking lot and accelerated onto the main road. "Available assets," she said. Greystone's jaw tightened slightly. "Weather over the region is sitting at about 200 feet. Nothing with a meaningful ordnance payload can get below cloud cover until approximately dawn. That's 9 to 10 hours out. QRF insertion is blocked by 2 choke points that the enemy has very deliberately positioned units to cover. Drone coverage is active, but they've been jamming our relays for the last 4 hours. He stopped. Then, "Which is why it's you." She nodded once, slowly. Not as if she was agreeing, more as if she was processing, integrating, running something through a mental architecture that operated several layers below ordinary thinking. "Who's commanding the unit?" she said. Greystone looked at her. "Captain Jason Brennan," he said. She showed no reaction. "Insertion window. 40 minutes. She looked out the window at the dark Kentucky road, passing outside the glass, at the scattered lights of the town that existed just outside the gate of one of the most powerful military bases in the world, where a Tuesday night was just a Tuesday night and people were playing pool and drinking beer and telling stories about deployments to men who nodded because they knew the language of those stories. 48 men, 11 hours, 1 rifle. "Okay," she said. Greystone watched her for a moment. In 32 years, he had worked with hundreds of special operations personnel, SEAL teams, Delta operators, Ranger battalion commanders, CIA paramilitary. He had developed over those years a finely calibrated sense of what different kinds of courage looked like. What he saw in Sarah Kincaid was something that didn't fit any of the existing categories. It wasn't fearlessness. He didn't believe in fearlessness, not in people who had actually done the things she had done. It was something closer to what he had once heard a veteran sniper describe as the reduction of the self to a single function. The complete subordination of everything personal preference, comfort, fear, desire to the operational requirement. She had gone from a bar stool to this car, to a mission that would have made most operators in this building ask for a night to think it over. And she had said okay with the same energy she might use to confirm that she'd received a routine email. He had seen her file, the real one. All 7 missions, every confirmed effect. And still sitting 3 feet from her in the back of a sedan on a Tuesday night in November, he felt something that he was not entirely comfortable naming. The driver turned onto the access road that led to a secondary airfield on the far eastern edge of the installation. Sarah Kincaid sat with the fuel ammo in her lap, closed one hand resting on top of it, eyes forward. 48 men in Helmand province were running out of time, and the only soldier going in after them was one that the rest of the army had decided wasn't worth noticing. That was exactly how she needed it. When they arrived at the airfield, the lights were low and the wind was coming off the runway in sharp, cold gusts that moved through the dark like something alive. A loadmaster in a flight suit was already waiting at the bottom of the aircraft stairs with a gear case, matte black, unmarked locks, with a biometric scanner rather than a key, and he handed it to her without ceremony, without words, without any of the usual administrative language of military logistics. She took it, carried it up the stairs herself, did not look back at the lights of the base receding behind her, at the ordinary Tuesday night world of Rosie's tap room, and pool tables with warped felt, and jukeboxes playing Merle Haggard. 48 men, 11 hours, 1 rifle. The ramp closed. The aircraft engines rose to a sound that made the whole airframe vibrate in a specific, recognizable frequency that Sarah Kincaid's body knew the way the musician knows the sound of their own instrument being tuned. She sat with the gear case at her feet and her hands relaxed in her lap and her eyes open in the dark of the cargo compartment. Back at Rosie's tap room, Tyler Brennan was on his 4th beer. He had not thought about the supply clerk again. He was telling a story about a firefight in Kunar province, speaking with the kind of authority that comes from genuinely having been there, genuinely having done the thing, genuinely earning the right to tell the story. And he was right about all of it. He had earned that story. He was a good soldier. He just had no idea that 12 time zones away, a position on a mountainside in Helmand province was about to be established by a woman he had already dismissed as irrelevant, and that everything that happened in the next 11 hours would be the kind of thing that Tyler Brennan himself, if he had been there, if he could have watched it, would have described in bars for the rest of his life, except that nobody would ever be able to, because officially it never happened. And the soldier who made it happen had a name that didn't appear in the official record. She was a supply clerk. She was Phantom 5, and the aircraft carrying her was already gone. The aircraft had been in the air for 22 minutes when Sarah Kincaid opened the gear case for the first time. Not to check the rifle. She already knew what was in there, knew the weight of every component, the specific torque of every fastener, the exact measurement of every adjustment she would need to make based on conditions she had already begun calculating in her head during the drive to the airfield. She opened it because the ritual of opening it, of seeing it, of placing her hands on the equipment that translated everything she was into, something the world could feel, that ritual mattered. Not sentimentally, practically. It set something in motion inside her that needed to be set in motion before she hit the ground. The rifle was custom configured to her specifications. Nobody else in the program used the same setup. The barrel length, the stock geometry, the trigger weight, all of it had been adjusted over 3 years of operational use to fit the precise mechanics of her body. The way a concert pianist's instrument is adjusted to the specific architecture of their hands. She ran her fingers across the receiver once, closed the case, leaned back against the airframe. 22 minutes in the air, roughly 18 minutes to the drop window, 40 minutes of oxygen at altitude, and then free fall into darkness over a province that had been killing soldiers from multiple countries for the better part of 2 decades. She thought about Captain Jason Brennan. Not Tyler Brennan. She'd processed Tyler Brennan and filed him away in the part of her mind that stored irrelevant information. Jason Brennan was different. His file was one she'd reviewed twice in the sedan on the tablet Greystone had handed her before they boarded. Captain Ranger Battalion 2 Tours, Silver Star, from his 2nd deployment for pulling 4 wounded men out of a kill zone under direct fire. The kind of officer his soldiers would walk into a wall for. 48 men, under his command, trapped in a firebase in Helmand with 200 fighters closing in from 3 directions. She thought about the terrain, the elevation, the wind patterns that Helmand threw at you in November, when the cold came down from the mountains and moved across the valley floors in unpredictable eddies that could shift a bullet's path at distance in ways that required constant real-time adjustment. She thought about all of this the way a surgeon thinks about a procedure in the moments before the first incision. Methodically, without emotion, without the luxury of hope or fear. The loadmaster touched her shoulder, held up 10 fingers. 10 minutes. She stood up. Back at Fort Campbell at Rosie's tap room, the night was still going. Tyler Brennan was on his 5th beer, and the story he was telling had grown larger, the way bar stories always grow. The distances longer, the enemy force bigger, the chaos more orchestrated in hindsight than it had actually been in the moment. That's not a criticism. That's what combat stories do. They metabolize the terror into something survivable, something that can be shared and passed around and used to make sense of the fact that you were there and you made it and some other men didn't. Walsh was listening, but not entirely present. He had been thinking on and off about the supply specialist who had left with the colonel, the one Brennan had pushed off the stool. Walsh had laughed at the time reflex group behavior, the social gravity of a moment pulling him into it, but the laugh had felt wrong in his body even as it came out, and now 2 beers later, it still sat wrong. "Hey," he said, cutting into Brennan's story, "that woman, the one who left." Brennan paused. "What's about her?" "The colonel who came in for her, you recognize him." Brennan thought about it, shrugged. "Some admin guy, probably her CO." Walsh shook his head slowly. "He wasn't admin." "How do you know?" "The way he moved," Walsh said. He couldn't articulate it better than that. It was the thing that separates combat veterans from everyone else, the ability to read another person's history in the way they carry their body. "He wasn't admin." Brennan stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed, but it came out slightly shorter than he intended. "You're overthinking it, man." Walsh picked up his beer, said nothing. He was probably right. He was almost certainly overthinking it. He set the thought down and let the conversation move on, but it didn't quite go away. 2,300 feet above the Helmand Valley floor, Sarah Kincaid went out the door of the aircraft into darkness and cold, and the roaring absence of everything solid. Free fall. The wind hit her like a physical force, not just pressure, but sound. A wall of noise that stripped away everything except the body's most fundamental data. She oriented by instrument by the display on the wrist unit that gave her altitude and drift, and the GPS coordinates of her target landing zone, and she fell through the dark with the rifle case strapped to her back and 48 men's survival as the only thought that was allowed to exist in her mind. At 600 feet, she deployed. The canopy opened with a crack that sounded enormous in the silence after free fall, and then she was floating and adjusting. Reading the wind, the way she read everything constantly precisely without panic, and steering toward a ridgeline that she had studied on satellite imagery for 11 minutes in the sedan, and had since committed to a level of 3-dimensional detail that most people couldn't achieve with a physical map in front of them. She landed clean. One knee touched the ground first, then she was on her feet, collapsing the chute, burying it under loose rock in under 40 seconds, already moving. The firebase was 2 kilometers north-northeast. The enemy positions, based on the last intelligence picture she'd reviewed, were distributed across 3 approach corridors, Eastern Ridge, Western Valley floor, and a southern choke point that the fighters were clearly planning to use as their main assault axis based on the concentration of manpower Greystone's people had observed before the jamming went up. She moved through the dark at a pace that someone watching might have described as unhurried, and that was in reality precisely calibrated to cover ground while maintaining sensory awareness of her surroundings. Not running, not walking, something in between that left no sound and disturbed no terrain feature unnecessarily. In 12 minutes, she reached the overwatch position she had selected from the satellite imagery. High enough to see, far enough to be invisible. Close enough for the rifle to do what the rifle did. She set up. It took her 4 minutes and 30 seconds to establish a stable firing position, configure the rifle for the specific conditions, temperature, humidity, estimated wind speed, and direction, based on what she could observe from the vegetation movement in the valley below, and glass the battlefield through the scope. What she saw confirmed what the intelligence picture had suggested and was worse. The firebase below was not yet under direct assault, but the enemy positioning was sophisticated. These weren't opportunistic fighters. Somebody with real tactical knowledge had arranged this. The approach corridors were covered, the likely extraction routes were blocked, and the concentration of fighters on the southern axis was larger than the last count had suggested, closer to 250 than 200. She scanned methodically, north to south, east to west, identifying equipment, identifying command elements, identifying the communications nodes, the men with radios, the men giving orders, because those were the first targets. Not because killing them was the highest priority effect, because silencing them was. The moment communications fragmented, coordination fragmented, and a coordinated assault of 250 fighters became something very different. A disorganized collection of small groups operating without a shared picture, making decisions based on fear and incomplete information. That was the first principle of what she did. Don't fight the army, blind the army, then let the army fight itself. She found the first radio operator in 40 seconds. He was on the eastern ridge, moving between two fixed positions, carrying a handset on his left side and a rifle across his back. She noted him, moved on, found a second on the western valley floor, a third near the southern concentration, a fourth, this one stationary, clearly a coordination node, positioned on elevated ground roughly 800 meters south-southeast, with sight lines to all three approach corridors. That one was the priority. She adjusted, settled, let her breathing slow to the rhythm she had learned over 6 years of practice, not the deep, slow breathing of relaxation, but the specific, controlled pattern that reduced body movement to its absolute minimum, that turned the human machine into something as close to stationary as a living body can become. In the fire base below, Captain Jason Brennan was on the radio. Eagle 6, this is Kestrel Actual. Request update on QRF status. We have movement on all three approach corridors, and our eastern position is taking sporadic fire. Requesting air support or personnel reinforcement. Over. The response came back with the particular quality of bad news being delivered carefully. Kestrel Actual Eagle 6. QRF insertion is not possible at this time. Weather over approach vectors is non-permissive for rotary wing. Fast movers cannot acquire targets below cloud deck. We are working the problem. Maintain your position. Over. Brennan stared at the radio handset for a moment. His sergeant major, a 22-year veteran named Garza, who had been in situations almost this bad twice before, watched the captain's face with the careful attention of a man who has learned that how the commander processes bad news in the first 30 seconds determines everything that follows. Brennan's jaw worked once, then he keyed the radio. Eagle 6 Kestrel, actual copies. Maintaining position, request you expedite. We have approximately 48 personnel and ammunition for sustained engagement of approximately 6 hours. After that, we're going to have a problem. Over. A pause. Then Kestrel Actual Eagle 6, copy all. Be advised an asset is being deployed to your area of operations. Details are not available at this time. Continue to maintain your position. Over. Brennan looked at Garza. An asset, he said. Garza's expression didn't change. Could be a lot of things. Could be nothing, Brennan said. Could be nothing, Garza agreed. Brennan stood up, walked to the eastern wall of the compound, and looked out at the dark. The sporadic fire on the eastern position had stopped 20 minutes ago, which was not reassuring. Sporadic fire meant testing. Silence meant deciding. Get the men rotated on the walls, he said. Full alert. Nobody sleeps. Already done, Garza said. Brennan nodded. He looked at the dark valley beyond the compound wire and thought about his Rangers, 48 men who had trusted him to put them in a position where they could do their job and get home. He thought about his brother Tyler back at Campbell, probably at some bar right now, probably telling stories completely unreachable. He thought about the asset that was apparently being deployed. He had no way of knowing that approximately 2 kilometers south-southeast on a ridgeline, he couldn't see in the dark, a woman he had never met was exhaling slowly and putting her eye to a scope. She fired. The first shot at 840 meters was not heard inside the firebase. At that distance, with the suppressor, she was running, and the ambient noise of a valley at altitude, the sound was absorbed into everything else. What happened at the target end was simply this: the enemy coordination node stopped coordinating. One moment the man with the radio was transmitting, and the next moment the radio was on the ground, and the southern assault axis had lost its primary command element. The effect was not immediately obvious. It took approximately 90 seconds for the absence of communications to register as a problem rather than a technical malfunction. In those 90 seconds, Sarah had already moved 40 meters laterally to a secondary position she had identified during her initial survey reset and was acquiring the Eastern Ridge radio operator. Second shot, 1,120 meters. The Eastern Ridge went quiet. Inside the firebase, one of the rangers on the eastern wall turned to the man beside him. "You hear that?" "Hear what?" "Exactly," the first ranger said. He meant the firing that had been coming from the Eastern Ridge had stopped. Not reduced, stopped. He keyed his radio and reported it to Sergeant Major Garza, who reported it to Captain Brennan, who said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Watch that ridge. Don't assume it's good news." It was good news. He just couldn't know that yet. On the Western Valley floor, the second radio operator was moving not tactically, not in response to a threat, but simply repositioning between two elements, the way a communications soldier does during a normal operational cycle. He had no idea anything was wrong. He had no idea the Eastern Ridge had gone dark. He had no idea that 860 meters to his east-northeast on ground he couldn't see and hadn't been briefed to consider. A rifle was tracking his movement with the patience of something that had no urgency, because urgency implied doubt and there was no doubt. She waited until he stopped moving. Clean shot, clean effect, 3 down, 1 to go on the communications architecture. And then the work would change from disabling command and control to shaping the battlefield in ways that 48 trapped rangers could feel but not explain. In the firebase, Captain Brennan was doing what good commanders do in the absence of information. He was building his own picture from the fragments available to him. Eastern Ridge silent for 4 minutes now. Western Valley floor, the movement he'd been tracking through his anodes, had slowed, then stopped. Southern concentration still active, still building, but the tempo of their movement had changed. They were still coming, but they were moving differently, more hesitant, checking their flanks in ways that suggested they were receiving information that didn't match their expected picture. "Garza," he said, "Sir, something is happening out there." Garza looked at the same darkness Brennan was looking at. "Yes, sir," he said. "Something is." "You think it's the asset?" Garza was quiet for a moment. "Then I think if it's not, we got very lucky very fast. And I don't believe in very fast luck." Brennan keyed his radio. "Eagle 6 Kestrel actual. We are observing significant reduction in activity on eastern and western corridors. Southern concentration is still building, but movement patterns have changed. Can you tell me anything about this asset? Over." The response took longer than usual. When it came, the voice on the other end was different, a higher authority. Someone who had been listening, someone who had stepped into the net because the situation required it. "Kestrel actual, this is Eagle Main. Your asset is active. Do not say again, do not fire on any contacts on the southern ridge line at elevation. That is your asset's position. Acknowledge Ayestro. Over." Brennan processed that. Southern ridgeline at elevation. He looked south. He couldn't see anything on that ridgeline. Not a light, not a movement, not a shape in the darkness. "Eagle Main Kestrel actual acknowledges. Can you give me any additional information on the asset? Over." A pause. Then Kestrel actual Eagle Main. "Negative additional information at this time. Your asset is working. Trust the process. Eagle Main out." Brennan lowered the handset, looked at Garza. "Trust the process," he repeated. Garza's mouth twitched. At least someone's working. On the ridgeline 2 kilometers south-southeast, Sarah Kincaid had completed the first phase and was already deep into the second. The communications architecture was gone. Now she was reading the battlefield the way a chess player reads a board, not piece by piece, but in patterns and shapes in the relationships between elements that revealed intention and vulnerability simultaneously. The Southern Assault Group was the largest and best organized. 200-plus fighters staged in a formation that suggested a command line advance behind an RPG screen, a tactic that worked well against fixed positions with predictable defensive responses because the RPG screen suppressed the defenders while the main body closed the distance. Against a static defense, it was a sound approach. But the approach assumed the defenders were the only threat. She found the RPG team leaders, 4 of them positioned at intervals across the southern front. She didn't engage them immediately, not yet. She was watching the timing of their movement, the spacing between them, the positions they were moving toward. Because what she was looking for wasn't the shot that eliminated a threat. She was looking for the shot that created a chain. The oldest principle of ambush, don't shoot the man. Shoot the man in a way that makes the next man walk into the position that kills him too. She found what she was looking for after 6 minutes of observation. The 4th RPG team leader on the far western edge of the southern formation was moving toward a position that would put him behind a berm. Good cover, solid firing position, the obvious choice. And 15 meters beyond that berm, partially concealed, was a cache of RPG rounds and propellant that someone had staged there hours ago in preparation for the assault. She calculated elevation, wind, the exact angle required to strike the propellant cache rather than the man directly. The man would survive the first shot, the cache would not, and the detonation of the cache would create a secondary event that would, she estimated, take out the RPG team, the berm they were using for cover, and send a very specific message to every other fighter in the southern formation that the ground they thought was safe was not safe, and that whatever was killing them could reach places they had not imagined were reachable. She waited for the team to reach the berm, watched them settle in, heard even at distance, even in the night, the faint sounds of a coordinated force preparing to initiate an assault. She fired. The detonation was not subtle. It lit the southern valley floor like a photographer's flash, a white-orange burst that lasted less than a second and left behind a crater and a silence that traveled through the entire enemy formation like a physical wave. Every fighter in that formation stopped, not tactically, not because they'd been ordered to stop, because the body stops automatically, involuntarily, when something unexpected and large and violent detonates 40 meters from where you were standing. In the firebase, every ranger on every wall turned south. Brennan was beside Garza in 4 steps. "What was that?" Garza said. Brennan looked at the darkness where the flash had been. He had been in enough firefights to recognize the difference between an incoming explosion and an outgoing one, between something aimed at his position and something that had gone off somewhere else. This had gone off somewhere else, and the direction was south. "That," Brennan said slowly, "is our asset." He said it quietly, but the ranger beside him heard it, and the one beside that one, and in 30 seconds it had moved along the wall in both directions, not as panic, not as alarm, but as something that shifted the collective posture of 48 trapped men from braced for impact to something harder to name. The enemy had just had something explode in their own formation, and whatever was doing it was invisible and unreachable, and it was apparently on their side. That mattered, not tactically, not yet, psychologically, because 48 men who believe they have been abandoned fight differently than 48 men who believe that something unseen is fighting for them. Sarah didn't see any of that. She was already moving to her 3rd position, the case on her back, the rifle broken down to its carry configuration in under 90 seconds, picking her way along the ridgeline with the particular silence of someone who has practiced moving on terrain exactly like this until the movement became unconscious. 3rd position, new elevation, new sight lines. She glassed the southern formation again. The detonation had done what she predicted, shattered the coordination of the assault axis, split the formation into clusters that were now operating without a shared directive. Some pushing forward, some holding, some actually beginning to pull back toward the positions they'd come from. The assault was not broken yet, but it was fractured, and a fractured assault against a defended position with a perimeter that was now actively tracking their approach. That was a different equation than the one the enemy commanders had designed. She found the secondary command element, a man who had stepped up to fill the gap left by the first coordinator she'd taken down. He was working hard, moving between clusters, physically repositioning fighters, trying to reconstitute the formation's coherence. Competent, experienced, exactly the kind of leader who could pull this back together in 20 minutes if he was allowed to. She didn't allow him 20 minutes. 4th shot, 960 meters. The secondary command element stopped trying to reconstitute the formation. Inside the firebase, Brennan heard his radio crackle. Eagle Main came back on the net, and the voice was clipped and focused. "Kestrel actual Eagle Main. Be advised, weather window is shifting. We may have a rotary wing insertion opportunity in approximately 4 hours. Can you hold over?" 4 hours, he looked at Garza. 4 hours of ammunition was possible. 4 hours of discipline and position integrity was possible. 4 hours while something invisible on a ridgeline he couldn't see continued doing whatever it was doing. That was a different calculation than the one he'd been running 90 minutes ago, when the net had told him QRF was blocked and fast movers couldn't hit below cloud deck. 90 minutes ago, he had been calculating how long 48 men could hold before the math stopped working in their favor. Now he was being asked if they could hold for 4 hours. Eagle main Kestrel actual, he said. We can hold. Over. Copy Kestrel actual. Maintain your position. Your asset is still active? Out. He lowered the handset. 4 hours, Garza said. 4 hours, Brennan confirmed. The asset, Garza said. Not a question, not quite a statement, just the word hanging in the air between them. Brennan looked south again. Nothing visible. No position he could identify, no muzzle flash, no movement on that ridgeline. Just the dark and the cold and the ongoing, inexplicable erosion of an assault force that had, by every reasonable analysis, held every advantage less than 2 hours ago. Whoever it is, he said quietly, they're good. He had no idea. On the ridgeline in her fourth position of the night, Sarah Kincaid rolled her neck once a single control rotation to release the tension that had been building in her upper spine and went back to the scope. The night was young. The enemy formation was fractured, but not broken. There were still approximately 200 fighters between this ridgeline and the firebase, and several of them were already beginning to adapt, beginning to understand that something was working against them from elevation, beginning to search the ridgelines with their own optics, beginning to ask questions that, if they found the right answers, would shift the situation significantly. She had to stay ahead of that, stay unpredictable, keep them looking in the wrong places. She found a cluster of 12 fighters who had consolidated behind a rock formation on the eastern edge of the southern quarter. Good instinct, that rock formation, exactly the kind of cover she would have used. And she spent 3 minutes understanding their pattern of movement and communication before she did anything. Then she made a choice that had nothing to do with the 12 fighters. She fired one round into the ridge wall 40 meters to the west of them. Not at them, into the ridge wall. The impact sent fragments and dust and sound in a direction that put it exactly between them and the Western Valley floor, in the dead space between two friendly elements, who were now convinced from the sound and the direction that they were receiving fire from the other. She watched through the scope as the two groups, without communication and without orders, began firing at each other. Not for long, 4 seconds, maybe 5. But in those 4 seconds, 12 fighters in the rock formation were taking fire from men they thought were enemy. And the men on the western floor were taking fire from a position they'd just been arguing was secure. 4 seconds of friendly fire accomplished something that 4 direct shots couldn't have. It told every fighter in a 200-meter radius that they could not trust their own picture of the battlefield, that the ground around them was not what it seemed, that the darkness was full of something they could not locate or predict or stop. That was fear. And fear in a force that had been operating on certainty and numbers and a carefully prepared plan. Fear was the most disruptive thing on the battlefield. Back at Fort Campbell at Rosie's tap room, it was nearly midnight. Brennan had gone quiet on his 6th beer, and Walsh was still thinking about the colonel and the supply specialist who had walked out of the bar 2 hours ago, and the manual on the bar floor with the classification marking that Walsh had barely glimpsed before Brennan dropped it. He pulled out his phone, looked at it, put it away. There was no one to call, and even if there had been, he didn't know what he would have asked. He just knew that something was happening somewhere, something that the woman at the bar was in the middle of, and that the way she had looked at Tyler Brennan, that specific, quiet, measuring look, was the look of someone who already knew things that Tyler Brennan was going to spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He picked up his beer, drank, said nothing. In Helmand Province, in her 5th position of the night, with the 4th hour approaching and the enemy formation continuing its slow grinding collapse, Sarah Kincaid was still working. She did not think about the bar. She did not think about Tyler Brennan or the manual on the floor or the way the room had laughed. She did not think about Fort Campbell or Kentucky or the glass of water with 2 ice cubes that she had left behind. She thought about 48 men in a fire base 2 kilometers north-northeast who did not know her name and would never see her face. She put her eye back to the scope. She kept working. Hour 3, 41 minutes past midnight local time. Sarah had fired 23 rounds. 23 rounds across 5 positions over 3 hours and 41 minutes, covering a battlefield that stretched nearly 2 kilometers in 3 directions. 23 rounds that had dismantled a communications architecture, detonated a weapons cache, triggered a friendly fire incident between two enemy elements, eliminated two secondary command nodes, and most importantly installed something inside every fighter in that valley that no bullet could remove once it was there. Doubt, not fear of death. Fighters in that province had been living with fear of death since they were old enough to hold a weapon. What she had installed was something more specific and more corrosive, the fear of not understanding. The fear that the ground you were standing on had already been seen, measured, and accounted for by something you could not locate, could not identify, and could not stop. She knew it was working because she could see it working. Through the scope, the behavioral signatures were unmistakable. Fighters who had been moving with the purposeful confidence of men executing a plan were now moving the way people move when the plan stops making sense. Shorter distances between stops, more time spent looking over shoulders, more clustering with other fighters for reassurance that actually made them worse targets collectively, which was the kind of tactical irony she never found funny because she understood the human need underneath it. When people are afraid of the invisible, they reach for the visible. They group together. They create warmth and solidarity in the sense that numbers mean safety. Numbers did not mean safety tonight. She was on her sixth position. She had moved deliberately away from the southern ridgeline after the fourth shot because the smarter elements in the enemy formation had begun scanning high ground to the south, which was the correct instinct and the predictable one, and predictable was dangerous. She had moved northeast along a secondary ridgeline that put her at a different elevation and a different azimuth, which meant every mental map the enemy had been building of where the fire is coming from was now wrong. She found a mortar team setting up on the Western Valley floor. 3 men a tube, and what her scope told her was approximately 30 rounds of ammunition staged in a line beside the tube. They were good. They had a concealed position, good overhead cover, and a firing solution that if they got it established would put indirect fire on the fire base at a rate in an angle that the Rangers' defensive posture was not currently configured to handle well. She studied them for 90 seconds. Not because she needed 90 seconds to make the shot she could have made any of the 3 shots in the first 15. She needed 90 seconds to understand the sequence. Which man to take first, which second, which third, and in what time interval to maximize the disruption without giving the surviving men enough processing time to react effectively. The answer was the man with the firing data first, because the other two could operate the tube without him if they had the data. Without the data, the tube was a very heavy piece of metal with no practical use. She fired, moved immediately, not running but the specific controlled fast walk she used when a position needed to be vacated before anyone triangulated the origin of the sound. 18 seconds to the next hide, she was back behind the scope before the 2 surviving mortar crew members had finished processing what had happened to the first. She watched them. One dropped flat. Good reflex trained, not panicked. The other went for the firing data the dead man had been holding. She watched his hands find the papers. Watched him start to move toward the tube. She fired. The third man was already moving when the second went down. Not toward the tube, not toward the data, but away, running at a low crouch in the direction of the nearest cluster of fighters 200 meters east. She let him go, not out of mercy, out of calculation. A running, terrified man arriving in that cluster and telling them what had just happened to his mortar team was worth more to her than a third confirmed kill. A running man was a messenger. And the message he was delivering, that the mortar team was gone, that the shooter was invisible, that the position everyone thought was safe had been reached from an angle nobody had been watching, that message was a weapon. She moved again. Into the fire base, Sergeant Major Garza was on the eastern wall when the mortar team's firing stopped before it ever started. He'd heard the setup, the distinctive sounds of a crew preparing a tube through the quiet of the valley, and he'd been calculating defensive responses in his head for 6 minutes. Then the sound stopped. Not interrupted, just stopped. The way things stop when they don't stop voluntarily. He found Captain Brennan at the command post. "Mortar team on the western floor," he said. "They were setting up. They're not setting up anymore." Brennan looked at him. "Asset? Has to be," Garza said. "Nothing we did." Brennan stared at this map on the table in front of him, a physical map, because their digital systems had been partially degraded by the jamming, and tried to build a picture of what was happening outside the wire. The eastern ridge had been quiet for nearly 2 hours. The western floor was intermittently active but disorganized. The southern corridor, which had been the primary threat, had been generating confused and contradictory movement patterns for the past hour and a half. He thought about the asset. He had been trying not to think about it too specifically, trying not to construct a picture of what was out there, because in his experience, when you started depending on something you couldn't see or control, you started making assumptions that could get people killed. But it was becoming impossible to ignore the shape of what the asset was doing, because the shape was becoming clear. Systematic, sequential, not reactive. The asset wasn't responding to threats as they appeared. It was anticipating them, removing them before they fully materialize. The mortar team was the clearest example. They'd been in a concealed position with overhead cover, and they'd been taken out before they fired a single round, which meant whoever was out there had seen them before they finished setting up, assessed the threat they represented, and solved it while Garza was still running the defensive math in his own head. "Garza," Brennan said, "Sir, how many people do you think are out there working for us?" Garza was quiet for a long moment. He had been in the Army for 22 years. He had served in 2 wars. He had worked with special operations units that he wasn't supposed to talk about in venues he wasn't supposed to discuss. He had a very good sense of what various force packages look like from the inside of a defended position, how a 4-man team moved differently than a 6-man team, how a full assault element created a different acoustic and visual signature than a small direct action element. "I don't know," he said finally, "but the pattern isn't what I'd expect from a team." Brennan looked at him. "What do you mean? A team moves with internal communication. You can hear it in the timing. There's a rhythm to how they sequence their shots, their movements, their positions. This is," he stopped, chose his next word carefully. "This is one rhythm, consistent, like one person's tempo." The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. "You're saying it's one person," Brennan said. Not a question, not quite a statement. The verbal equivalent of a man standing at the edge of something very high and looking down. Garza said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Brennan turned back to the map. He put his finger on the southern ridgeline, the position Eagle Main had told him not to fire on. He moved his finger along the secondary ridgeline to the northeast, which is where the shots seemed to have been coming from most recently, based on the directions of impact and the sound signatures his rangers on the walls had been reporting. One person, moving alone, in hostile territory, at night. He thought about what that meant, and then he stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it in those terms, one person alone in the dark, keeping 48 men alive, with nothing but a rifle, and whatever was happening inside their head, thinking about it in those terms made him feel something that he recognized as awe. And awe was not operationally useful right now. "Keep the men on the walls," he said, "full alert, and make sure everyone knows not to fire south or northeast." "Already done," Garza said. Again, hour 4, 12 minutes past 0100. Sarah was on her 8th position. She had covered nearly 3 kilometers of ridgeline in 4 hours, which sounds slow until you understand that every meter of that movement was conducted in darkness, in hostile territory, with a rifle case on her back, in complete silence, reading terrain that she had studied for 11 minutes on satellite imagery, and was now navigating in 3 dimensions with real wind and real rock and real drop-offs that the satellite imagery had suggested but not fully communicated. She was also, and this was the part she never discussed with anyone, not Greystone, not her handlers, not the after-action debriefers who sat across from her in clean rooms with recording equipment. She was also managing something that was neither fear nor exhaustion, but was adjacent to both. The specific kind of sustained tension that accumulated in the human body after 4 hours of operating at maximum cognitive and physiological output in an environment where a single mistake had consequences measured in lives. Not her life. The lives of 48 men in that fire base who would never know her name. She managed it the way she managed everything, by reducing it to its components. What was the tension accumulated sensory data processed at high speed over an extended period, creating a kind of neural heat that needed to be vented without venting it into her performance? How did she vent it? By moving. By the physical act of relocating between positions, which gave her body something to do that was not sitting still, which interrupted the accumulation cycle, which let the system cool slightly before she went back to the scope. 4 hours in, she had 29 confirmed effects, 2 communications nodes, 1 weapons cache detonation, 1 mortar team, 4 direct command elements, multiple disruption shots that had achieved the psychological effects she'd calculated. Roughly 60 fighters had been rendered ineffective through either direct action or the breakdown of command cohesion that her operations had created. Roughly 140 remained effective, maybe 150, which meant the math was still wrong. She was one person with one rifle, and the enemy still had numbers that, if they organized and pushed, would overwhelm the firebase's defensive capacity before the weather window opened. The key was keeping them from organizing, keeping the fracture lines she'd created from healing, which required a different approach now because the approaches she'd used in the first 4 hours, sequential target removal, psychological disruption, shots, manipulation of friendly fire, those had run their effective cycle. The enemy commanders who were still alive had adapted enough to be suspicious of the obvious. They were moving less predictably, communicating through physical runners instead of radios. Since the radio operators were gone, and they were beginning, she could see it in the movement patterns, to consolidate their remaining effective elements into a smaller, tighter, more disciplined formation that could execute a single-focus push rather than the 3-corridor approach that she had systematically dismantled. A focused push by even 100 disciplined fighters against a perimeter held by 48 men in the next 3 hours before weather cleared was a serious problem. She needed to prevent the consolidation. She thought about it for 90 seconds, which was longer than she usually spent on tactical decisions, because this one required more precision. Not in the shooting, in the choice of target. She needed one shot, one specific shot that would interrupt the consolidation process in a way that was visible to every element in the formation simultaneously. Something that happened to the consolidation itself, not to an element on its perimeter. She found it. The consolidation was happening around a fixed point, a large rock formation near the center of the Southern Valley floor that had become organically the rally point for the reconstituting force. Fighters were moving toward it from multiple directions, using it as the organizing element for the new formation. It was good instinct, fixed reference point, defensible position, visible to everyone, and whoever was directing it was thinking clearly. She didn't shoot the director. She tried that approach in the first phase, and the formation had adapted by distributing command authority. Shooting leaders now would only cause them to flatten their command structure further, which would make it more resilient, not less. She shot the reference point, not a person, the rock. 3 shots rapid sequence into the face of the large rock formation at the precise angles required to create the maximum fragmentation effect without achieving penetration. The shots sounded different from the direct fire engagements, more explosive, less precise, and the fragments they sent in multiple directions at high velocity created an effect in the formation that was simultaneously physical and psychological. 3 men in the immediate vicinity went down with fragment wounds, none fatal, and every fighter in a 100-meter radius suddenly understood that the consolidated position they'd been moving toward was not a safe rally point, but an identified target. The consolidation stopped. The enemy formation, for the second time in 4 hours, shattered into its component parts, and those parts stopped trusting each other and stopped trusting the ground they were standing on and started thinking about survival in the individual rather than the collective sense. That was the moment. She recognized it when she saw it because she had created it before in other valleys against other forces. The moment when a collective military will fractures into individual human wills, and individual human wills, when they are sufficiently frightened and confused, make choices that are about survival rather than mission. In the firebase, the Rangers heard the 3 rapid shots and the sounds of chaos that followed from the Southern Valley, and Sergeant Major Garza said very quietly to no one in particular, "There it is." Captain Brennan looked up from the radio. "There what is," said Corporal Rodriguez, 22 years old, and on his first deployment, standing 3 feet away on the wall. Garza looked at him for a moment. "The reason we're still here," he said. Rodriguez didn't fully understand that. He filed it and moved on. But 6 years later, in a VA waiting room in San Antonio, he would tell the story of that night to a stranger in the chair beside him, and he would use exactly those words, "the reason we're still here," without fully being able to explain what he meant, only that Garza had said it and that it was true. Hour 5, 0217. The radio in the firebase crackled. Eagle Main coming back on the net with a voice that carried something it hadn't carried 2 hours ago. Something close to relief, though military radio protocol doesn't have a format for relief. Kestrel actual Eagle main. Weather window is confirming earlier than projected. We have rotary wing inbound to your position in approximately 90 minutes. QRF package, 8 birds full, combat load. Confirm your status. Over. Brennan grabbed the handset. Eagle main Kestrel actual. Perimeter is intact. All 48 personnel accounted for. We have taken 3 wounded, none critical. Enemy activity has been significantly degraded. Repeat, significantly degraded on all approach corridors. We are ready to receive QRF. Over. A pause. Kestrel actual Eagle main copies. Outstanding. Continue to maintain position. Do not repeat, do not engage on southern ridgeline or northeast ridgeline. Your asset is still active. Out. Brennan set down the handset. He looked at his watch. 5 hours and 17 minutes since insertion. 5 hours and 17 minutes since he'd been looking at this radio, calculating how long he could hold before the math stopped working. And now he was looking at the same radio, being told that help was 90 minutes out, and his perimeter was intact and all 48 of his people were alive. He sat down on an ammunition crate just for a second, just to let something through that he'd been holding back for 5 hours, and pressed the back of his wrist against his mouth. Garza looked away, gave him the moment. 90 minutes, Brennan said. 90 minutes, Garza confirmed. We can hold 90 minutes. We could hold 90 minutes 4 hours ago, Garza said. Now we could hold 6 hours. Brennan looked at the map, at the southern ridgeline, at the northeast ridgeline, at the invisible line between the fire base and whatever was out there in the dark, still working, still moving, still keeping the math on the right side. I want to know who it is, he said, quietly. Not a demand, almost a question, the kind of question you ask when you already suspect the answer is going to change how you think about something. You might not get to know, Garza said. Some assets. I know, Brennan said. I know. On the northeast ridge line, Sarah had heard nothing of that conversation, but she felt the shift in the battlefield, the way she always felt these things, not through information, but through the cumulative evidence of 1,000 small behavioral signals filtering through the scope. The enemy formation's consolidation attempt had failed. The southern corridor was effectively broken. The eastern ridge was still quiet. The western floor had reduced to a handful of isolated elements operating without coordination or shared purpose, which made them tactical problems for the firebase's own defensive fires, rather than strategic threats requiring her specific attention. She was not done. 90 minutes until QRF, 90 minutes of vulnerability remaining. And an enemy force that was broken, but not gone broken forces, sometimes reconstituted faster than you expected, especially if a strong leader emerged, or if one element's success gave others a direction to rally around. She needed to stay. She needed to keep the pressure on. Not through more direct engagement. The formation was too scattered now for sequential targeting to be effective, but through presence. Through the specific kind of invisible pressure that made every fighter in that valley keep asking the question she wanted them to ask. Where is it, and is it looking at me right now? She fired one round into the rock, faced 30 meters from the largest remaining cluster on the western floor. Not at anyone, just a round in the dark from a direction they hadn't expected, impacting close enough to feel personal. The cluster scattered. Every man in it moved to a different position, and every man in it, as he moved, was thinking about the thing he couldn't see rather than the firebase he was supposed to be attacking. That was enough. She lowered the rifle, settled her back against the rock, let herself breathe differently for 30 seconds, a different rhythm, longer and slower, designed to bring something down that she'd been holding elevated for the past 5 hours. Not relaxation, just maintenance, a system check on a machine that still had 90 minutes of operation required. She thought about the 48 men in the firebase. She thought about Captain Jason Brennan, who she'd never met and whose voice she'd never heard, and the 22-year-old kid on the wall, who was probably wondering how he was still alive. She thought about Garza. She'd read his file too briefly, in the context of understanding the unit she'd be supporting, and she thought about what it meant to be 22 years of experience, looking out over a valley that should have killed everyone you were responsible for. She didn't think it was sad. She didn't think it was glorious. She thought it was the job. Hers and theirs and everyone's who had ever stood between something and the people it was moving toward. She raised the rifle, put her eye back to the scope. 68 minutes remaining. She kept working. In the valley below, a fighter who had been moving alone for 20 minutes, cut off from his element, running low on ammunition, trying to find a position that felt safe, stopped behind a boulder and pressed his back against it and listened to the night. He had been in this province for 3 years. He had fought in 11 operations. He had never in 3 years and 11 operations felt what he was feeling right now, which was the specific and overwhelming sense that the darkness itself was watching him. He stayed behind that boulder for 11 minutes. He dared not move toward the firebase. He did not move toward his element. He stayed behind the boulder and waited for something he couldn't name. He was not the only one. Across the valley floor, in the scattered remnants of what had been a coordinated assault force of 250 fighters, dozens of men were doing the same thing, not retreating, not advancing, just stopping, waiting, trying to understand what was happening to them and unable to construct an explanation that made tactical sense. Because the explanation didn't make tactical sense. The explanation was one person on a ridgeline who had spent 5 hours turning a battlefield into a question no one could answer. Sarah checked her ammunition count. She had enough. She always had enough because she calculated expenditure before she started, and she did not miss, and she had not missed tonight. She found a new cluster forming on the southern floor. Not a consolidation, just proximity, men gravitating toward each other in the dark, and she studied it for 4 minutes before deciding it required no action. They were not organizing, they were sheltering. There's a difference, and the difference matters because shooting men who are sheltering rather than threatening is a different kind of act, and she had never confused the two. 51 minutes remaining. She settled into the wait with the same quality of attention she'd brought to every other minute of the night. The darkness held, the firebase held, 48 men held, and somewhere on a ridgeline in Helmand Province that no map would ever mark Phantom 5 held too. Hour 6, 0344. The radio inside Firebase Kestrel had been quiet for 11 minutes, which was either very good or very bad, and Captain Jason Brennan had learned over 2 deployments that 11 minutes of quiet in a situation like this one meant the situation was about to change in a direction you hadn't fully anticipated. He was right. The change came from the south, not gunfire, something different. A sound that took him 3 full seconds to identify because he hadn't expected to hear it in this context in this valley at this hour. It was voices, not the controlled radio traffic of a military net or the shouted commands of a force organizing for assault. It was the specific, ragged, overlapping sound of men arguing, loudly, in the dark, in the middle of a battlefield where 11 minutes ago there had been silence. Garza appeared at his shoulder. "You hear that?" "I hear it." "They're fighting each other," Garza said. Not a question. Brennan listened. The voices rose and fell. Multiple sources, multiple directions. The acoustic signature of a group that had lost its internal cohesion and was now fracturing along whatever fault lines existed underneath the surface of its collective purpose. He had heard that sound before once in Kunar Province, after a particularly effective airstrike had destroyed a command element mid-operation. The sound of an army losing faith in itself. "How many shooters do you think are out there?" Corporal Rodriguez had asked Garza that question 2 hours ago. Now Rodriguez asked it again, standing 4 feet away on the eastern wall this time, with a different quality in his voice. Not scared. Something closer to reverent. Garza looked at him for a long moment. "Based on what I'm hearing right now," he said carefully, "I'm not sure anymore." Rodriguez frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Garza said, "that what's happening to those men out there, the level of psychological disruption, the pattern of it, the way it's been sustained for 6 hours without a single gap, that's not what a team does. A team has seams, handoffs, moments where the rhythm breaks because one person stops and another starts." He paused. "This has no seams." Rodriguez stared at him. Then he looked out at the dark valley. Then he looked back at Garza. "One person," he said, flat, disbelieving. Garza said nothing. "Sarge, that's not possible." "A lot of things that happened tonight aren't possible," Garza said. And yet, on the northeast ridgeline, Sarah heard the argument in the southern valley and felt something she would never have described as satisfaction. Satisfaction was too personal, too self-referential, but felt something that functioned like confirmation. The fracture she had been maintaining through 6 hours of sustained, precise, relentless pressure was now self-sustaining. The enemy formation had passed through the phase where external force was required to keep it broken and into the phase where it was breaking itself. Internal blame. Conflicting accounts of what had happened and who was responsible. The specific human tendency under extreme stress and confusion to turn on the nearest available target. She had 43 minutes until the QRF window. She used 30 of them to do something she had not done in 6 hours watch without shooting. Not because she was done, because she was reading. She was taking the full picture of the battlefield, every cluster, every isolated individual, every movement pattern across the entire operational area, and doing a final accounting. Final threat assessment. Determining which elements, if any, retained the will and the capacity to organize a push against the firebase in the 43-minute window before 8 helicopters arrived and changed the arithmetic permanently. 3 elements concerned her. Not the arguing mass in the Southern Valley that was effectively neutralized, not by elimination, but by dissolution, which was a more permanent kind of neutralization because you couldn't reconstitute it quickly with leadership changes the way you could reconstitute a force that had simply lost people. The 3 elements that concerned her were on the periphery, one on the far eastern approach, one dug into a ravine on the northern edge of the western floor. And this one was the most concerning, a small disciplined group of 8 fighters who had not been part of any of the disrupted formations, who had been moving steadily and quietly along the southern ridgeline for the past 40 minutes in a pattern that suggested they were not trying to assault the firebase. They were trying to find her. She had been watching them for 22 of those 40 minutes. They were good, the best she had encountered tonight. Moving in a dispersed pattern that made them difficult to engage as a group using terrain features intelligently, and heading in a direction that wasn't exactly right, but was close enough to right to be concerning over the next 30 minutes. She made a decision, not the decision to engage them that was obvious, the decision about sequence. Because engaging them required her to break from her overwatch position covering the firebase approaches, and the 30 seconds she spent moving and reestablishing to engage the search team was 30 seconds in which the firebase's other 2 peripheral threat elements were unmonitored. She calculated it, ran the sequence 3 times in the part of her mind that processed these calculations the way other people processed arithmetic automatically, instantly, with a clarity that didn't require conscious effort. The search team needed to be addressed first. Not because they were the greatest threat to the Rangers, the peripheral elements were larger. But because if the search team found her, none of the rest of the calculation mattered. She moved, not along the ridgeline this time. Down, lateral movement across slope angling northeast to put herself above and behind the search team's projected path. She covered 200 meters in 6 minutes, which would have been impressive on flat ground in daylight and was something else entirely on broken terrain, in the dark in complete silence with a rifle case on her back. She established her position above their projected path and waited. They arrived 90 seconds later. Moving well, she watched them through the scope, 8 men disciplined spacing the lead element using hand signals rather than voice, which told her they had either been briefed to maintain noise discipline in this area, or they had independently concluded that sound was what had been getting their comrades killed all night. Both possibilities said they were thinking, and thinking enemies were more dangerous than reacting ones. She watched them for 40 seconds. Long enough to understand their movement pattern, their spacing intervals, the way the lead man checked terrain before committing the element behind him. He was good. She noticed that in the same dispassionate way she noticed everything without judgment, without feeling just as data that informed the decision. She made her choice, not the lead man. The second man, because taking the lead man caused the element to stop. It's the automatic response, the trained response, stop and assess when the point goes down. But taking the second man causes something different. The lead man doesn't know immediately what happened behind him. The element loses its internal reference for a critical 3 to 4 seconds. And in those 3 to 4 seconds, with the element disrupted and the lead man turning to understand what happened, the element clusters just slightly, just momentarily in a way that changed the geometry of the follow-on shots. She fired. The element reacted exactly as she'd predicted, controlled and fast, which confirmed they were trained, but clustered momentarily around the point man who had turned, which confirmed they were human. She took the 4th man in the cluster with her second shot. Then she was moving again before the 3rd shot because 2 shots from the same position in under 4 seconds was enough for a trained team to begin a rough triangulation and she did not intend to be where the triangulation pointed. 31 meters lateral. New position. Back to the scope. The 6 remaining fighters of the search team were now doing the right thing, dispersing, going flat, moving in opposite directions to deny her a concentrated target. Exactly correct. If she had been a fixed position, that would have been effective. She was not a fixed position. She found 2 of them, took one, watched the other reach the cover of a rock shelf and go still. Left him there. He was no longer moving toward her, and he was no longer moving toward the fire base, and he was now a man lying flat behind a rock in the dark, trying to understand something that couldn't be understood from his current position, which meant he was exactly where she needed him to be. 4 of the original search team were now combat ineffective. 4 were dispersed, static, and focused entirely on their own survival. The search for her was over. She moved back to her overwatch position. 31 minutes to QRF. She checked the eastern approach. The peripheral element there, a cluster of 15 fighters, had been static for 20 minutes. She watched them for 90 seconds. They were not organizing. They were waiting, which was the residue of an army that had lost its directive, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next for a command that wasn't coming, because the people who issued commands were gone. She left them. The ravine on the northern edge of the western floor was different. The element there, she counted 11 fighters now down from what had appeared to be 17 earlier, suggesting that 6 had drifted away during the hours of chaos, was moving. Not toward the fire base. They were moving east, which was away from the fire base, which meant they were exfiltrating, choosing survival over mission. She let them go. She had let people go before, and she had never second-guessed it because the decision wasn't moral, it was tactical. A retreating force is not a threat. A retreating force that is allowed to retreat lives to fight another day, which is a strategic problem. But it is not her strategic problem at 0414 in the morning, with 29 minutes until QRF and 48 Rangers who needed those 29 minutes to stay quiet. The battlefield was not won. That wasn't the right word. The battlefield was controlled. She had taken a situation that had every mathematical indicator of catastrophe and bent it over 6 hours and 31 confirmed shooting positions and a number of rounds she would count precisely in the after action, but that she knew was approaching 60 into something that looked like survival. She felt the weight of that number 60 rounds, 31 positions. 6 hours, not with pride, not with exhaustion, but with the specific gravity of a person who understands exactly what they have just done and exactly what it cost. 26 minutes. She found the peripheral element on the eastern approach one more time. Something had changed. In the 90 seconds she'd spent watching the ravine, something had changed on the eastern approach. The 15 fighters who had been static were no longer static. They were moving, and they were moving toward the fire base. She processed this quickly. Not panic, she didn't do panic, but the rapid, high-priority resequencing of a plan that had just encountered a new variable. Why were they moving now? What had changed? She scanned for a command element, someone who had arrived among them, someone who had given a direction that restarted the stalled machine. She found him in 12 seconds, a man who had not been among the 15 before. He had come from the south, from the direction of the fractured main formation, and he was moving through the group with the specific controlled authority of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. He was talking to them, not arguing, directing, and they were responding. She had 8 seconds before they had enough momentum to become a problem she couldn't solve with one shot. She took the shot. The man from the south went down. The 15 fighters stopped, lost their direction again. Stood in the dark for 4 full seconds, she counted in the specific paralysis of men who have just watched their sudden renewal of purpose evaporate in a single moment from a source they couldn't locate. Then they dispersed. East, away from the fire base, every one of them. She exhaled. 19 minutes. Inside the fire base, Brennan heard the single shot from the east, heard the subsequent sound of men moving away rather than toward, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 6 hours and 40 minutes. He didn't know what had just happened on the eastern approach, not the specifics, not the sequence. But he understood the result because the result was audible in the direction and the diminishing volume of the sounds coming from out there. They were leaving. "Garza," he said. "I hear it," Garza said. Rodriguez on the wall said nothing. He was gripping the top of the wall with both hands and staring east, and his jaw was working slightly. in the way it does when a 22-year-old first deployment soldier is processing something that his entire mental model of the world is not equipped to contain. Brennan walked to the eastern wall and stood beside him. He looked east. Nothing visible, just the dark and the sounds of men moving away from it and the specific silence that follows when a threat stops being a threat. "You okay?" he said to Rodriguez. Rodriguez swallowed. "Sir, who is out there?" Brennan looked at the dark. He thought about what Garza had said about seams, about the rhythm, about the 6 hours of sustained, seamless, relentless pressure that had turned 250 fighters into what was now, by every measurable indicator, a broken and dispersed force that was no longer a tactical problem. "I don't know," he said, honest. "I genuinely don't know." Rodriguez looked at him. "But it's one person, isn't it?" Brennan said nothing for a moment. "Then go back to your sector." "Sir Rodriguez." Brennan's voice was quiet, not harsh. "Go back to your sector. Keep your eyes on your lanes. We have 16 minutes. Rodriguez went back to his sector, but he didn't stop thinking about it. Not then, not ever. Hour 7:04:29. The first helicopter was audible at 12 minutes out, the distinctive thud of rotary wing at low altitude that every soldier in a field position learns to distinguish from every other sound in an operational environment, because it is the sound of either salvation or threat, and the determination of which it is has to happen in about 4 seconds. The Rangers on the walls heard it and knew. Not salvation or threat uncertainty, they knew. The sound was coming from the right direction and at the right altitude and with the right signature. 8 birds full combat load. They're people. Brennan keyed the radio. "Eagle Main Kestrel, actual. We have rotary inbound. Confirm QRF package. Over." "Kestrel, actual Eagle Main. Confirmed. 8 birds, 40 QRF personnel, combat configured. Pop smoke on my mark for LZ identification. Over." "Eagle Main copy. Standing by. Over." He looked at Garza. "Pop smoke on the mark." "Ready," Garza said. He was already holding the canister. The sound grew. At 6 minutes out, it was loud enough that the Rangers on the walls were turning their heads toward it, involuntarily, the body's automatic orientation toward the thing that meant survival. At 4 minutes, it was loud enough to fill the firebase, the way music fills a room completely from every direction at once. At 2 minutes, Brennan said, "Mark." Garza pulled the canister and threw it into the designated LZ area. The smoke rose, infrared visible, color-coded, the specific language of military extraction operations that pilots and ground units speak without words. The first helicopter came in fast and low and settled with the controlled authority of a pilot who had done this in worse conditions. Then the second, then the third. By the time the fourth was on the ground, the QRF element was already moving, fanning out to establish a security perimeter, and the firebase for the first time in 7 hours had more boots on the ground than the defensive requirement demanded. Brennan stood in the center of the LZ and watched them come off the birds and felt something move through him that he had been holding back since the moment he got on the radio 6 hours ago and heard the weather was non-permissive and the QRF was blocked, and the only available asset was something nobody could tell him anything about. The QRF commander, a major named Stein, whom Brennan knew from a previous rotation, jogged across the LZ and grabbed his hand. "Jason," Stein said, "talk to me. What's your status?" 48 personnel, 3 wounded, none critical. Perimeter intact. Brennan heard himself saying it, and it still sounded improbable. "Enemy forces effectively dispersed. We are not currently under direct threat." Stein stared at him. "You had 250 fighters on you." "We did. And you held with 48 people." Brennan looked at him for a moment. "We had an asset," he said. "What asset?" "The weather." "I know what the weather was," Brennan said. "We had an asset." Stein waited for more. Brennan didn't give him more because he didn't have more to give. He had 7 hours of effects and no explanation for them that fit any template he'd ever been taught. In the operations center at the forward operating base 40 kilometers east, Colonel Arthur Greystone was standing in front of a live feed from a surveillance asset that had been orbiting Firebase Kestrel at altitude for the past 3 hours, providing real-time imagery of the battlefield. He had been watching it for those 3 hours with 2 other men in the room, both civilians in the technical sense of the word, which in this context meant nothing about their actual background, and none of the 3 had spoken much. What was on the feed didn't require much commentary. The confirmed count, assembled from the surveillance footage and the ground reports and the signals intelligence that had been partially restored in the last 2 hours, as the enemy jamming degraded along with the cohesion of the force generating it, the confirmed count was 97. 97 confirmed effects, direct and indirect, single operator, 7 hours, 31 positions. One of the civilian men said quietly, "That's a record." Greystone said nothing. He had known what Sarah Kincaid was capable of. He'd read 7 mission files, and he'd been the one who'd made the call in the sedan, who'd looked at the situation and the available assets, and made the calculation that putting one person into that valley was not a reckless gamble, but the most operationally sound decision available. He'd believed that when he made it. He still believed it. But believing something and then watching it happen across 7 hours of surveillance feed were different experiences, and he was not entirely sure the word record was adequate to what he was looking at. "Where is she?" he said, not to either of the men specifically. To the room. One of them tapped his tablet. Last confirmed position was the northeast ridgeline at 0412. She went dark after that standard protocol stopped emitting any trackable signature. "She's moving to the extraction point," Greystone said. "Yes, sir." "Get the bird up." "Already up, sir. She should be at the extraction point in he checked. Approximately 22 minutes. Greystone nodded. He looked at the feed one more time. The firebase intact, 8 helicopters on the ground. Rangers moving. The dispersed remnants of what had been a 250-fighter assault force, scattered across a valley floor, isolated. Disorganized, no longer a coherent military threat, 97. He thought about the bar, about the colonel who had walked into Rosie's tap room and extracted an asset that the room full of Rangers had written off as irrelevant. He thought about what it meant that this was how the system worked, that the most capable operator he had ever worked with in 32 years of service spent her days in a cover identity so complete that the people who served beside her not only didn't know what she was, they actively dismissed her. He thought about whether that was right, whether it was the only way or just the way they had chosen. He didn't have an answer. He rarely did about the things that mattered most. 22 minutes later, in a flat, rocky clearing, 6 kilometers from Firebase Kestrel, a helicopter with no markings settled briefly onto the ground. A figure emerged from the dark, moving at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, the same pace she always moved, the pace of someone who had calibrated every physical output to its precise operational requirement and nothing more. She carried a rifle case and nothing else. She loaded herself and the case without assistance and without ceremony, and the helicopter lifted before she had fully settled into the seat. She sat with the case across her knees and looked at nothing in particular in the dark of the cargo compartment. The crew chief leaned over and held up a tablet. He'd been told to show her the number when she boarded. It was the protocol. Greystone had instituted it after her 3rd mission because he felt she deserved to know the operational result even if the debrief was 48 hours away. She looked at the tablet, at the number, 97. She looked at it for 3 seconds. The crew chief watched her face the way people watch faces when they expect an expression that matches the magnitude of the number, some visible registration of the weight of it. She handed the tablet back. She leaned her head against the airframe. She closed her eyes. The crew chief sat back in his seat and didn't say anything, because what was there to say? He had been flying special operations personnel in and out of operational environments for 9 years. He had seen men come off missions and cry, and men come off missions and laugh, and men come off missions and not speak for 4 hours. He had never seen someone look at a number like that and simply return it, as if the number was just a number, as if it confirmed something she had already known but had no use for beyond the confirmation, as if it was just the job. The helicopter banked east toward the forward operating base, toward debriefs and reports in the machinery of an institution that would file what had happened tonight in rooms that most people in that institution would never enter. Below in Hellman Valley, the first light of dawn was beginning to gray the eastern edge of the sky. Firebase Kestrel was secure. 48 Rangers were alive. The QRF element was establishing the expanded perimeter. Somewhere in the valley, the surviving fighters of what had been a 250-man assault force were making their individual ways toward whatever came next for them, carrying with them an experience that none of them had language for. They had not been defeated in the way armies understood defeat, by superior force, by overwhelming firepower, by a larger and better equipped opponent. They had been taken apart piece by piece from a direction they could never identify by something they could never locate over 7 hours that felt to the men who survived them like being hunted by something that existed in the darkness itself. They would talk about it. Of course they would. People always talk about things that break them as a way of trying to understand the breaking. And the stories they told would grow and change and accumulate detail the way all stories do. But the core of the story, the part that stayed constant across every telling, in every language, in every context, was always the same. They had not been fighting soldiers. They had been hunted by a phantom in the mountains. And the phantom had never missed. Inside Firebase Kestrel, Captain Jason Brennan stood at the edge of the LZ and watched the last of the QRF birds unload. Garza stood beside him as he had stood beside him for 7 hours, constant and capable and present. "Garza," Brennan said. "Sir?" "The asset, it's gone, isn't it?" Garza looked at the sky. "Extracted," he said, "before we even landed the QRF." Brennan nodded. He thought about that. About the specific quality of sacrifice embedded in that sequence. 7 hours of sustained, invisible work, and then gone before the people you did it for even had the chance to see you. Not even the acknowledgement of presence, not even a face to put to it, just the result. 48 men alive, a valley cleared, a firebase intact, and somewhere in the dark, a helicopter moving east with a single passenger who would never be named in the official account of this night. "I want to find out who it was," Brennan said, quietly, not for the first time. "I know," Garza said. "Is that possible?" Garza was quiet for a long moment. The dawn light was strengthening on the eastern horizon, gray, turning toward pale gold, the specific light of morning after a night that should have ended differently. "Probably not," Garza said. "But sir, does it change anything?" What they did. Brennan looked at the valley, at the dispersed remnants of a force that had tried to kill every man in this firebase and had failed because of something that had never needed them to know its name. "No," he said. "It doesn't change anything." He looked east, in the direction the asset had gone, in the direction of a helicopter he couldn't see carrying a person he didn't know moving toward a world that didn't know they existed. "But I'd like to say thank you," he said, very quietly. "To no one." The dawn kept coming. The valley held its silence. And 48 men began the process of understanding that they were alive when they should not have been, which is one of the most complicated things a human being can ever be asked to understand. The debrief lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. It took place in a room at the forward operating base that had no windows and no designation on any base directory, and it was conducted by 3 people. Greystone, one of the civilian men from the operations center, and a woman named Dr. Carla Reyes, who was nominally a psychologist, but whose actual function in the program was something more complex and more specific than that title suggested. She was the person who sat across from Sarah Kincaid after every mission and tried to take an accurate measurement of what the mission had cost. Not the operational cost, the human cost, the interior cost that didn't show up in after-action reports. Sarah sat across from them in a straight-back chair and answered every question with the same quality of precision she brought to everything else. Shot sequencing, position changes, wind adjustments, target prioritization decisions, the moment she identified the search team and the calculation she ran before engaging them. The decision to allow the retreating Western element to exfiltrate rather than engage. Every decision, every variable, every result. She spoke in the flat, clear language of someone reporting data, because that was genuinely how she experienced it, as data, as a sequence of inputs and outputs, as a 7-hour operational problem that had been solved to the required standard. Reyes watched her face throughout. She had been doing this for 3 years with Sarah across 7 missions, and she still found herself searching for the thing that wasn't there. Some register of the weight of 97, some visible acknowledgement that the number was enormous, and that the person who had generated it in a single night was sitting in a room talking about it like she was describing a training exercise. It wasn't dissociation. Reyes had seen dissociation, and she knew what it looked like, and this wasn't it. Sarah was fully present, fully engaged, answering with nuance and self-awareness, and in several instances, a candid acknowledgement of moments where her calculation had been uncertain, and the outcome had depended on an edge that was narrower than she'd have preferred. It was something else. Something that Reyes had been trying to find the right clinical language for across 3 years and 7 missions and had never quite succeeded. The closest she'd come was this: Sarah Kincaid experienced the performance of her function with the same emotional register that most people experience breathing. It was necessary, it was precise, and it was deeply fundamentally who she was. The weight of it was not absent. Reyes was certain the weight was there, but it lived somewhere deeper than expression. Somewhere that Sarah either could not access in a debrief room or had decided a long time ago not to bring into one. At the end of the 4 hours, Greystone leaned forward. "The count," he said, "97 confirmed. It's unprecedented." Sarah looked at him. The objective was to keep 48 personnel alive until QRF could insert. "Yes. The count is a byproduct of the method required to achieve the objective," she said. Not defensively, just accurately. Greystone held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. "You're stood down for 72 hours. Get some sleep." She stood. "Yes, sir." She moved toward the door. "Kincaid," Greystone said. She stopped, turned. He looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had chosen his words carefully for 32 years, who had learned that the right thing said in the right way at the right time was a precision instrument as surely as anything on that ridgeline. And he was finding, sitting across from this particular person on this particular morning, that his 32 years of careful word choosing were not quite adequate to the thing he wanted to say. 48 men are alive," he said finally, "because of what you did tonight." Sarah said nothing for a moment. She looked at him with those brown eyes that moved like a hawk's constant measuring, seeing everything. "I did my job," she said. She left. Reyes waited until the door closed. Then she wrote 3 words in her notebook and underlined them twice. She would spend the next 6 months trying to fully explain those 3 words in clinical language and would ultimately conclude that clinical language was not the right tool for this particular observation. The 3 words were, "She means it." 48 hours after Firebase Kestrel, Fort Campbell looked exactly the same as it always did. The gate traffic, the formation runs at 0600, the supply depot where Specialist Sarah Kincaid had her desk, and her requisition forms, and her cover identity, and her unremarkable service record that said nothing about anything that mattered. She was back at her desk by 0730 on the second day. Same chair, same desktop, same stack of logistics paperwork that had accumulated in her absence, which her cover story accounted for with a training rotation in another state that nobody had any reason to investigate. She sat down. She opened the top file on the stack. She began working. At 11:14 that same morning, Staff Sergeant Tyler Brennan walked into the supply depot. He came in the way he came into every room, taking up the full social space of his entry, confident by default, his physical presence announcing itself before he'd consciously decided to announce anything. He had his cover story ready. He needed to follow up on a requisition for his unit's equipment list, something vague enough to be plausible, specific enough to justify him being there. He had rehearsed it 3 times walking across the parking lot. He had told himself also 3 times that this was just administrative, that he wasn't here because of anything except the requisition. He spotted her immediately. She was at her desk, head down, working, the same way she'd been at the bar, present and occupied and completely unaware of or completely uninterested in the fact that he had entered the room. He walked to the counter. There was a young PFC at the counter who looked up, and Brennan gave him the cover story, the requisition, the equipment list, and the PFC said he'd need to check with the specialist handling that battalion's account. And he turned and called across the room. "Specialist Kincaid, can you come up?" She looked up from her desk. She saw Brennan at the counter. Nothing moved in her face, nothing at all. She stood, picked up a folder, and walked to the counter with the same even unhurried pace she brought to every physical movement. She stopped across the counter from him. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had spent 48 hours processing what had happened in that firebase. Not the tactical details. He still didn't have the full picture, and what picture he had came from inference rather than confirmed information. But he had spent 48 hours with the residue of 7 hours in a position he should not have survived, running the math of how his 48 men were alive, when every version of that math he'd learned in 18 years of military service said they shouldn't be. And somewhere in the middle of those 48 hours, around hour 36, at about 3 in the morning, Sitting on the edge of his rack, in the dark of his quarters at the FOB, he had started connecting things that he had not previously connected. A supply clerk who read classified ballistic calculation manuals at a bar. A colonel he didn't recognize who extracted her with the urgency of a man who had somewhere important to be. An asset deployed to Firebase Kestrel that the entire chain of command refused to describe beyond the instruction, "Don't fire on the ridgeline." He had sat with those three things in the dark at 3 a.m. and felt the connection form the way you feel a bone set a sharp, clarifying pain, followed by something that had been wrong for a long time, suddenly being right. He was not certain. He had no confirmation. He still had no confirmation standing at this supply depot counter looking at Specialist Sarah Kincaid across a laminate service covered in requisition forms and unit equipment lists. But he was certain enough. She looked at him. "Sergeant Brennan," she said, even, professional, as if he were any soldier at any counter on any ordinary day. He opened his mouth, closed it. The cover story he'd rehearsed 3 times in the parking lot had evaporated completely, and what was left in its place was the specific vertiginous feeling of a man who has just realized the scale of his own error. Not the pushed bar stool, not the destroyed manual, not the public performance of contempt for a person he had written off in 30 seconds, based on a branch insignia in a table she was sitting at alone. Those things were part of it, but they weren't the whole of it. The whole of it was what those things represented: his absolute certainty that he could read a person in 30 seconds, that the information his confidence fed him was reliable, that the architecture of his judgment was sound. It was not sound. The woman standing across this counter had spent 7 hours keeping his brother alive. Not in the abstract, not as part of a unit, not as one asset among many. Specifically, individually. In the dark, on a ridgeline alone with one rifle and a mathematical precision that his entire career of training and deployment and accumulated combat expertise could not have replicated. And he had pushed her off a bar stool. "I need to," he started, stopped. She waited. She did not help him. Not unkindly, she simply waited the way she did everything, with that quality of infinite patience that was not passive, but active, a form of presence so complete it made the space between them feel very small. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out unpolished and direct, the way honest things come out when the rehearsed version has failed. "What I did at the bar I was wrong. I was disrespectful and I was wrong, and I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression didn't change. Not softening, not hardening, not the particular satisfaction that the apology was designed on some level to produce. Just steady. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay. You came here to say something. You said it." She looked at him with those eyes. Was there a requisition? He stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then something shifted in his face, not amusement exactly, but the cousin of it, the specific expression of a man encountering something that is both unexpected and precisely correct. "No," he said, "there wasn't a requisition." "Then I'll get back to my desk," she said. She turned. Kincaid. She stopped. Turned back. She gave him the same quality of attention she gave everything, complete, unfiltered, and entirely without sentiment. He wanted to say it. He had been working towards saying it for 36 hours, the actual thing, the thing underneath the apology. He wanted to look at her and say, "I know what you did. I know it was you. My brother is alive because of you, and I need you to know that I know that, because the alternative, the idea that the person who saved his life would never hear anyone say it, felt like an injustice that he was responsible for, in a way he couldn't entirely articulate." But he looked at her face, at those eyes, and he understood in the way that certain things are understood without being said, that she already knew that he knew, and that it did not change anything for her, and that the thing she needed from him, the acknowledgement, the gratitude, the weight of the moment fully received, was not something she needed at all. She had said, "I did my job." She made her head. He nodded, once. The kind of nod that carries more than its physical dimensions suggest. The kind that means I understand enough. Not everything, but enough. "Thank you," he said quietly. 2 words stripped of everything except their actual meaning. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she nodded back the same nod, the same weight, and turned and walked back to her desk and sat down and opened the file she had been working on when he came in. Tyler Brennan stood at the counter for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked out of the supply depot into the ordinary Fort Campbell morning, and behind him the door swung shut, and the room went back to its ordinary sounds. At her desk, Sarah Kincaid looked at the file in front of her. She read the first line. Then she read it again. Then she turned the page. She did not think about Tyler Brennan. She did not think about the bar or the manual on the floor, or the 7 hours on the ridgeline, or the number 97, or the 48 men who were alive in Helmand Province at this moment, going through whatever process a person goes through when they understand they survived something they shouldn't have. She thought about the requisition form in front of her. She thought about what it required. She filled it out. That was the job. 1,400 miles away, and 4 time zones east in a hospital at Bagram Airfield, a ranger named Rodriguez, 22 years old, first deployment Eastern Wall of Fire-based Kestrel, was sitting in a waiting room while a medical staff sorted out the paperwork for his wounded colleague's transfer stateside. He had been sitting there for 40 minutes and had nothing to do except think. He had been thinking about the same thing for 48 hours, the same question rotating through his head in the specific obsessive way that unanswered questions lodge in young minds that haven't yet learned to leave certain things alone. One person. He had run the numbers himself roughly with the limited information he had. 7 hours. The shot patterns his unit had been tracking, the directions, the positions they'd been able to infer from sound and impact. He had been in enough firefights to understand what a single shooter's output looked like versus a team's, and Garza had been right. There were no seams. One rhythm, consistent, sustained for 7 hours without a gap. One person. He had asked Captain Brennan once on the helicopter back from the FOB. Brennan had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Rodriguez, some things in this army exist in places that don't have names. And when you encounter one of those things, and tonight you did the right response, is to understand what it did for you and let go of what it was." Rodriguez had nodded. He had not let go. He pulled out his phone. He looked at it. There was nothing to search. He had no name, no unit, no identifier of any kind. He had the ridgeline, which was a coordinate in his memory. He had the number 97, which Garza had quietly told him after the debrief, the way Garza told him things as facts delivered without ceremony that he was expected to receive and integrate and carry. 97, one night, one person. He put his phone away. He looked at the waiting room wall. He thought about being 22 years old on an eastern wall in Helmand Province, gripping the top of the wall with both hands, listening to the sounds of an assault force fracturing in the dark, knowing something was out there and not knowing what, and feeling underneath the fear, underneath the training, underneath everything he had learned about what soldiers were and what they did, feeling a specific, wordless thing that he had not been able to name until right now, sitting in a waiting room at Bagram 48 hours later. Safe. He had felt safe. In the middle of a fire base surrounded by 250 fighters, outnumbered 6-1 with weather-blocking air support, and QRF blocked by covered choke points, he had felt in some part of himself that operated below rational assessment safe, because something was out there. Something was working. Something he couldn't see and couldn't identify was between him and every threat in that valley, and whatever it was not going to stop. He had been 22 years old, and he had felt safe because of a person whose name he would never know. He sat with that for a while. The waiting room hummed with its ordinary sounds. Then he took out a small notebook, the kind Rangers carried for field notes, and he wrote one line. Not for anyone else. For himself. A way of keeping the thing he'd been given, of honoring the weight of it without being able to address it to anyone specific. He wrote, "Someone went out there alone, so we didn't have to." He looked at it. Then he closed the notebook and put it in his pocket and sat back in his chair. Back at Fort Campbell at 1527 that afternoon, Colonel Arthur Greystone stopped by the supply depot. He did not go to Sarah's desk. He stopped at the counter, spoke briefly with the PFC there about a logistics matter that was in fact genuine, one of the administrative covers that kept the ordinary machinery of her cover functioning, and while he was at the counter, he glanced across the room. She was at her desk, working, head down, same as always. He thought about the debrief, about the 4 hours and 17 minutes of precise, detailed, emotionally unloaded reporting from a person who had just done something that would never be in any public record, that would never be acknowledged at a ceremony, that would never produce a ribbon or a medal or any of the visible tokens the military used to mark the distance between ordinary service and extraordinary sacrifice. He thought about 32 years in uniform, about the men and women he had known who had been genuinely exceptional, not competitively, Not as a point of pride, but in the functional sense of the word, the sense that meant the thing they did at the level they did, it was simply not within the reach of most people, regardless of training or will or desire. He had known several. He had worked closely with four, and in 32 years he had not encountered anyone who carried what they were with less need for the world to know about it. Not because she was humble. Humility implies an awareness of a gap between your worth and its acknowledgement. Sarah didn't experience the gap. The acknowledgement was irrelevant to the function. The function was everything. The acknowledgement was nothing. She did not need it the way she did not need the bar full of rangers to understand who she was, because their understanding had no operational value, and operational value was the only currency she was spending. He finished his business at the counter. He walked toward the exit. He passed within 8 feet of her desk without stopping. She did not look up. He pushed through the door into the Fort Campbell afternoon and walked back toward his vehicle and thought about 48 men in Helmand Province who were alive and one woman at a desk who would never be thanked for it in any way that the world would see. He had asked her once 18 months ago between missions in the sterile room with the recording equipment whether the invisibility was hard, whether the cover, the absence of acknowledgement, the particular loneliness of being the most capable person in every room you entered and being required to perform incompetence, whether any of it was hard. She had thought about it. Not dismissively, she took his questions seriously always. She thought for about 8 seconds, which in a brief was a long time. Then she said the visibility would be harder. He had not fully understood that at the time. He thought he understood it better now. If she were visible, if the world knew, if the rangers in that bar had known, if the army had held a formation and put her in front of it and said, this is what this person did, the function changes. The function becomes about the being known. And the being known has weight, and the weight has drag, and the drag slows the thing that needs to be fast and precise and unencumbered by the world's opinion. She was not invisible because the system required her to be. She was invisible because it was the only condition under which she could be entirely what she was. And what she was had kept 48 men alive through 7 hours in Helmand Province, and would keep other people alive in other valleys in the future, and would go on doing so in the specific, seamless, unhurried way that it always had, without name, without record, without the world's acknowledgement, without need of any of it. At Rosie's taproom that Thursday night, Tyler Brennan sat with Walsh and the same crew they always sat with, and the jukebox played, and the pool table with the warped felt drifted, the 8-ball slightly left, the way it always did, and the Budweiser sign buzzed in the window. He was quieter than usual. Walsh noticed because Walsh noticed things, and Walsh had been thinking about things for 72 hours that he wasn't sure he was supposed to be thinking about. Hey, Walsh said during a lull in the table's conversation. The supply clerk. That night. Brennan looked at him. The one you, Walsh stopped. What did you find out? Brennan was quiet for a long moment. The table had gone slightly still, the way tables go still, when the person at the center of them changes temperature. Enough, Brennan said. Walsh looked at him. Enough to what? Enough to understand that I was wrong, Brennan said. Flat direct, no performance in it. The same way you say true things when you're done trying to manage how they land. The table was quiet. Nobody had heard Tyler Brennan use those words in that order about anything related to his judgment of another person. Walsh set down his beer. How wrong, Walsh said. Brennan looked at the bar top. He thought about his brother, about a satellite phone call he'd received at the FOB, Jason's voice coming through with the specific quality that voices have when their owners are still processing the fact that they're alive to make the call. Jason had said, we had an asset, Tyler. I don't know who it was, I don't know if I'll ever know, but whoever it was, they carried us for 7 hours alone. Tyler had said nothing on his end of the call for about 5 seconds. Then Jason had said, I need you to really hear that. Someone went out there alone for us. Tyler heard it. He had been hearing it for 72 hours. Wrong enough, he said to Walsh. That's all. Walsh nodded slowly. He picked up his beer. He looked at the bar in front of him and thought about classification markings on the spine of a field manual and a colonel he hadn't recognized, and a woman with brown eyes who had looked at Tyler Brennan with a steadiness that Walsh had spent 3 days trying to find the right description for. He found it sitting at Rosie's on a Thursday night, beer in hand. She had already known everything that mattered, and she hadn't needed him or Tyler or any of them to know it back. Walsh raised his beer. not to anyone visible. Just raised it. Brennan saw it. He raised his. The table didn't know what the toast was for. They raised their glasses anyway, the way people do when the gravity of a moment is felt before it's understood, and maybe never fully understood at all. At her quarters on Fort Campbell at 2217 that Thursday night, Sarah Kincaid sat on the edge of her rack with a cup of coffee going cold on the bedside table and the same field manual repaired rebound with new tape along the spine open in her lap. She was reading the same page she had been reading at Rosie's tap room 4 days ago before Tyler Brennan's hand came down on it. The page about wind drift and bullet drop at elevation. The page she had read so many times that the information had long since passed from knowledge into reflex, into the automatic physical computation that happened below thought during the seconds before shot. She read it anyway, not for the information, for the same reason she opened the gear case before a mission, not because she needed to see what was inside, but because the ritual of it set something in motion that needed to be set in motion. She closed the manual. She set it on the bedside table beside the cold coffee. She lay back on the rack. She looked at the ceiling. Outside, Fort Campbell moved through its Thursday night the way it always did occasional vehicles on the roads, the distant sound of a formation PT session from a unit that ran nights, the particular ambient quality of a military base after dark, where everything was simultaneously on and off. She thought about nothing that had happened in Helmand Province. She thought about nothing that had happened in the supply depot. She thought about nothing that Tyler Brennan had said, and nothing that Greystone had said, and nothing that the number 97 meant or didn't mean. She thought about the wind patterns in November at altitude, which were going to require specific adjustments the next time she went somewhere cold, and whether the configuration she'd used on this mission could be improved in one specific way that had occurred to her on the helicopter back. She closed her eyes. In 7 hours, she would be at her desk. She would open the top file on the stack. She would fill out the requisition form. She would be to every person who passed her desk exactly what her cover said. She was a quiet, unremarkable supply clerk who kept to herself and did her job and had never seen combat. She would be Phantom 5. The most dangerous warrior in any room she entered would never be seen, and she would never need to be.